In this video, we're going to take a look at performance charts within vCenter. Now, if you're using the free ESXi product and you don't actually have vCenter, you'll actually be able to use these charts as well, but the only thing you'll have access to are the real-time statistics. When we're using vCenter, vCenter will collect performance statistics on an ongoing basis from our hosts and then get that into the SQL Server database where we can generate various views on it. So in this case, I'm taking a look at the performance tab of one of my hosts, and you can see that we've got two areas, the overview and the advanced, and we'll take a look at the advanced in a minute. But inside the overview, you can see that I've got view and also a time range. If you were using the free ESXi product, you'd be able to see real-time statistics, but you wouldn't be able to see these aggregated statistics that we have for daily, weekly, or custom time periods. You'll also see that we have a couple of views. In this case, at the host level, we have both a home view and a virtual machines view. And in the home view, we can see that we have the key performance stats associated with the host. So we can see the CPU usage in total of the host. We can see memory usage, and we can see different types of memory. The balloon driver, which is what we use to actually apply memory pressure to the guests in order to get them to free up memory. We can also see the amount of memory that's used. We can see how much swap is being used. But again, VMware strongly prefers to get the guests to do their own swap because they're going to have much more intelligent means to determine which memory is in use. And they have all the mechanisms that the local memory manager has for doing things like tracking page utilization and reference frequency. And we really want to try and swap pages that we're not consistently or constantly accessing and not move that into the swap. Generally, we don't really want to see VMware using much of its own swap, and we'd prefer to actually see that being done by the guests directly. And there's a few different ways we can handle swap in VMware, so take a look at some of the other videos where we've talked about some of the swap placement that you can do and how that's going to affect vMotion, and also whether or not you have local swap turned on in the hosts. You can see also how much memory was granted, also how much memory is shared. And again, much like the ballooning, this is one of the interesting tricks that VMware uses to try and reduce actual physical memory usage. The balloon memory driver creates memory pressure, but the shared memory driver allows VMware to see when our guests have common data in memory, and probably a good portion of the operating system files will be common if we're running multiple guests of the same type. If that memory is consistently the same on multiple machines, that will be made a shared memory page. And if any of the virtual machines need to modify that page, then a new copy will be transparently created in memory. But the original page is kept shared for the virtual machines that didn't modify it. And then the new virtual machine that's modified it to a new state will have its own private copy. Or that new state might match up with a page that's already in memory for another virtual machine and will get shared with that other private copy. And this all happens transparently and at high speed. There's also memory compression, but we actually don't see that happening directly in this view. We can also see the memory throughput rate, so we can see swap in and swap out rate if we actually are using swap. We can see disk latency, but again, this really just tells us the highest latency. It doesn't break it down by which virtual machine or which data store it's associated with. But we can also see the disk utilization for the top 10 disks in the system. This is based on queue depth. We can see as well the CPU utilization in megahertz. And we can also see the kilobits per second top 10 disk rates. We can also see memory utilization and other disk requests for the disk level, network requests, and also the actual rate of network packets. So that's all pretty useful, but is really focused on the host. So if we switch the view over to virtual machines, then we're going to get more of a breakdown of the virtual machines that are running on them. And you see it's really a lot of the same statistics that we had previously, except now, rather than being focused on the host, we get smaller summary versions of those graphs, which are focused on the individual virtual machines. So each virtual machine in this case now has its set of small graphs. We can scroll over to see more of those. And also we'll see that we have summary graphs that are based on the top 10 virtual machines. In this case, I only have 2 virtual machines, so it's reasonably straightforward, and we can see we're reasonably well dividing up our resources. But that might not always be the case. We could see disk and network information for the top 10 virtual machines as well. But still, this might not really be enough. So we also have the option to switch over to the advanced view. And we'll see that in this case, it starts to look a little bit more like Windows Performance Monitor, although it is quite different in the end in how it behaves. So once I switched over to the advanced view, the utilization in % for the host, the utilization in % for each of the CPUs, or at least in this case, the virtual cores that I have for these CPUs, and also the utilization in megahertz. So you'll see within the chart view that on the left-hand side, we have, in this case, a percentage, and on the right-hand side, we have a megahertz. So in this case, our chart actually does include a couple of different scales, and we'll just have to make sure that we're reading it correctly. And we don't think that we're using 300% of our CPU capacity or anything like that. So in this case, we're getting a pretty basic view of CPU information. If we look at this drop-down, we can see that we can do a switch to, and we can view the CPU information we have now. We can also switch over to a view of the data stores, and we can see in this case it's focused on latency and reading and writing. And we can switch over to individual disks that make those up and see how the disks which back up the data stores are performing on, again, a pretty high summary type level of certain statistics, but there might be more information that we're interested in here than what's being presented directly. And we'll take a look at how we can switch these options in just a minute. We can also see that we have various memory charts, and we've got network and power information and storage adapter information or storage path information. And we've also got some system statistics about how VM kernel is behaving and the various components that exist within inside VM kernel, such as the iSCSI software initiator or other services. The AAM, for example, is the high availability agent for use with vSphere HA clusters and various other areas as well. And if we take a look over to storage adapter or storage path, we can also see the particular HBAs. This can help us get a good idea as to whether or not we're getting good load balancing across the various multipath options for our SAN. And it's always a good idea to go in and verify these things. Even when the system is working well and you're not experiencing performance problems, it's going to allow you to establish a good baseline and a good understanding of what these numbers look like under typical utilization, so that you can more easily identify what might not be as expected when things start performing badly. And you might ask yourself why you'd really need to use these tools at all when you already have things like Performance Monitor inside your virtual machines. The biggest issue is that the virtual machines now don't really get an accurate picture of what's happening. If we look at the CPU utilization inside the virtual machine, it may say that it was 50% or 100%, but of what? It's a little hard to actually tell what true allocation occurred at the host level once the VM kernel had had a chance to do all of its various virtualization tricks. So looking at utilization numbers from the guest is not really going to give us an accurate picture. However, there are performance counters on the guest that would be useful to us. Anything relating to latency or delays or queuing may tell us that the virtualization stack is adding too much latency and is causing performance to suffer and causing various delays to occur within the stack. Especially anything that slows down I/O performance for the disks or network performance or memory performance is going to affect us greatly. Everyone in a physical world tends to focus on things like CPU and memory utilization, and in a virtual world, those things are still important, but we have a lot more tools in order to influence it, such as shares and reservations and resource limits. So take a look at some of the other videos where we talk about allocating virtual machine performance options to see how some of those areas affect all of this. You can see that we can print directly from here. We can do a quick refresh, although you see that does have an auto refresh as well. And when you go to save the data, it will actually export it as an image so that we can just copy and paste that into a document or a report that we might be generating. But you'll see that we also have a pop-up chart window that we can do. And if we click on that, we can get a separate window along with these other ones separately from the rest of the vSphere client. But if we click over to the chart options button, you'll see that we can actually customize these charts quite a bit. And there's various counters that are going to be available depending on our configuration, either at the real-time level or on a summarized basis from data that's been collected and put into the vCenter database. So as we see, if I take a look at my CPU here, there's various utilization information that's included by default, but there's a lot more information that we could add, like how much time we're spending on idle or how much time we're utilizing each core or what our wait time is, where we're waiting for the CPU to become available, and so on. And when we get into things like the data store, we can see that we don't actually collect data statistics from vCenter from the data store, but we do have real-time information, such as latency or how the storage distributed resource scheduler has been operating, and things like the storage I/O controller. If you're using a version of VMware that actually supports all those capabilities, this is definitely going to help us validate that it's working correctly and that we're getting the kind of throughput and performance that we expected. And under disk, we have, again, lots of other information that we could add beyond what's included in those graphs by default. Now, I'm not going to go through all the details of all the various counters, but there are definitely a lot of latency-related counters. In the memory, we can see we have lots of information about swapping, but also how much page sharing we're doing with the transparent page sharing. Potentially may also be doing compression, which is another trick that VM kernel can do to more effectively use memory by actually zipping it. That does take CPU usage, but the trade-off is usually better for performance than having to do swap to disk. So we can see all of that type of behavior and get a much better idea for what's happening inside VM kernel. So we can customize these charts at this level, in this case at the host level, but you'll see that we also have very similar performance options available at the resource pool level, the DRS cluster level, once we have a DRS cluster set up, and also at the virtual machine level. So as we can see, the performance options for the virtual machines are pretty well similar. The resource pool and the host are all pretty well similar because we're focused on the same areas. But if we go to, for example, the data center level within vCenter, we'll see that the presentation that we get is quite different. And here, we really only get a storage view. We don't get a consolidated view of things like CPU and memory and network and disk performance at the data center level. But if you want to do that across multiple hosts, you do get that if you're using a DRS cluster. So if you have an enterprise edition of VMware and you configure a DRS cluster, then you will be able to see an aggregated view of all the resources of the cluster and the various resource pools that make up that cluster as well. So take a look at the DRS videos for more information about that. And again, on the advanced view for the data center, we don't really have the same type of options. We don't have the ability to aggregate all the details. And so we just get these virtual machine operation details, which can still be useful, but are not going to give us a big picture view of what's been happening performance-wise. One other thing I'd like to point out, though, is that you may want to tune these statistics and how they're gathered and how long they're maintained for. So if you go back to the homepage of vCenter and go over to the vCenter server settings, you'll see that under statistics, we have the ability to specify how much data gets collected and how long it gets saved for. So we can see that it's keeping statistics level 1 for 5-minute windows or 5-minute intervals for 1 day, 30-minute intervals for a week, 2-hour intervals for a month, and 1 day for a year. If we click on these and click edit, I can increase the statistics from level 1, which is basic metrics, all the way up to level 4, which is all the metrics, or somewhere in between, for example, or level 2, which is CPU, memory, disk, and network information. So if we were to increase that, for example, to level 4, we can see that estimated database size increases greatly. And if we decide that we're going to keep that for even longer periods of time, then that's also going to change those numbers pretty dramatically. So at this point, we're probably looking at SQL Server Enterprise Edition, and it's not necessarily appropriate to have a database this large, depending on how prepared you are to do maintenance of a database that large and whether you have the storage capacity to do it. But we can tune these things for larger environments in order to gather more information and keep it for a longer amount of time. You can also exclude certain amounts, but the major thing here is that we can't have a higher level of detail at a less granular time period. So I can't say that I want to keep statistics at level 1 for the 5-minute period and then at level 4 for the 1-day period, even though in theory that would be useful. We're not able to do that because the summarization process that takes all of the data out of the database won't be able to aggregate at a higher level than the raw data that it's using to aggregate. And that's just a side effect of how the data collection and storage happens within vCenter. So we can tune these statistics. You might not have 50 hosts or 2,000 virtual machines, but you're definitely going to want to think carefully about all of this and how you're going to want to configure it for your environment. It's also important, if we want these statistics to work correctly and we want data to be purged out of the database properly, take a look at the database retention policy settings, and also that you're running the SQL Server agent with your vCenter SQL Server instance, because it has some scheduled jobs that go in and do maintenance tasks on this. So that gave us a little bit of a look as to what we can do within the various performance graphing features in vCenter. Again, you can use this without vCenter, but you'll only get access to the real-time statistics. In another video, we're going to take a look at this information using ESX Top from the shell environment, which also provides us some other interesting capabilities, and some of the other videos related to virtual machine performance, the distributed resource scheduler, and a couple of other areas. So take a look at those too.